When we picture heroes, we don't often think about the orange jumpsuit of a convict. But in prisons, amongst thieves and murderers, there are still people who know right from wrong. And when the lives of these guards were in danger, convicts came to the rescue. The Call of Duty. Usually in prison, the guards enforce the rules and the prisoners follow them. But when a riot erupted at Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina in 2012, everything got turned upside down. In the early evening, around 120 inmates rioted, overpowering a guard, beating him, and taking him captive. The situation looked dire, and the standoff between the prisoners and authorities lasted for 5 hours. The problem was the police didn't know where in the prison the inmates were keeping the guard hostage, so they couldn't intervene without risking the officer's life. That was until one convict had the bright idea to use his contraband cell phone to call the authorities. He told them that the inmates were holding the guard in a broom closet, and with this information, a SWAT team was able to sweep in and free the officer. After the riot was suppressed, the guards went around and confiscated all the contraband phones. But if you ask me, they might be better to leave a couple just in case, especially for the hero who blew his contraband cover to save a life. Empathetic adversaries. In this CCTV footage from 2015, 17-year-old Jamal Rutledge is being processed at the Fort Lauderdale Police Department. As Officer Folk is booking the teenager for burglary, the policeman begins to feel a pain in his chest and collapses onto the floor. The handcuffed Rutledge looks around for help, but realizes they're alone. So he gets up and starts calling for assistance, kicking the security door to alert the other police officers. Officers soon rush into the room and begin performing CPR on Officer Folk. Thanks to Rutledge's quick thinking and ability to put aside the fact that Folk had just arrested him, Folk was saved from a potentially deadly heart attack. Fort Lauderdale PD even held a ceremony to honor the teen for his actions. Unfortunately, Rutledge would make many return visits to the police station for the wrong reasons in the following months. Hopefully the staff were a little friendlier to the delinquent with an empathetic heart. Heimlich heroes. On March 11, 2016, Correctional Officer Cuevas was eating his lunch in the educational building of the San Quentin prison when delicious disaster struck. A chunk of steak became wedged in his throat and he began choking. In his panic, he got up from his desk and looked to educational clerks for help. He was more than a little surprised when the first people that rushed to help were 3 veteran inmates. One started performing the Heimlich maneuver, another patted him on the back, and a third found a phone to call for help. After a short while, they managed to dislodge the nearly deadly luncheon from his airways. After he'd had time to recover, Officer Cuevas praised the prisoners that saved his life, noting how their time in prison had successfully turned them around. The steak, meanwhile, was sentenced to life in the trash can. Opportunity not wasted. On a scorching summer's day, inmates from the Polk County Jail in Georgia were on a work detail at a local cemetery. As the day wore on, the guard on duty began to struggle in the heat. He started hyperventilating and collapsed, leaving the prisoners unattended. So only 1 week after 2 prisoners murdered their guards and escaped jail in another Georgia jail, the Polk County inmates were left with a decision. They could have easily fled to freedom, leaving the officer for dead, showing the same callous disregard for human life as those other Georgia inmates had. But they didn't. 6 of the prisoners immediately rushed to help the guard. They removed his bulletproof vest so he could breathe before calling the paramedics who helped resuscitate him. And thanks for saving a life, instead of potentially fleeing the prison system, all 6 inmates had their sentences reduced by a quarter. A brush with death. For most of us, toothbrushes aren't exactly the most threatening objects, but in the wrong hands, they can be a surprisingly deadly weapon. No one knows this better than Florida Corrections Officer James Chapman. In 1983, Chapman was on shift, disciplining Alphonse Mathis Jr. for pursuing a relationship with a fellow inmate. Mathis didn't take this well, and unfortunately for Chapman, he happened to be armed. Mathis drew out a homemade shiv fashioned from a toothbrush melted to hold a razor blade and lunged at the CO. Fortunately, another inmate saw Mathis's intentions, shoving him at the exact second he slashed at the officer's throat. Thanks to the perfectly timed shove, the blade just missed Chapman's neck and grazed his chest instead. 2 other prisoners chased Mathis down the hallway before some guards tackled him. Chapman was left with an 8-inch gash across his chest, but the injury was only superficial. If it wasn't for those quick-thinking, compassionate inmates, he could have easily suffered a much worse fate. Chapman experienced a serious slice of luck, being surrounded by convicts who refused to let their imprisonment diminish their sense of common humanity. Florida's Officer Rescue Force. It must be a strange feeling owing your life to an attempted murderer, a sex offender, and someone convicted of home invasion. But I doubt Deputy Ken Moon cared who was helping him out when he was brutally attacked in 2009 while on duty at Orient Road Jail, Florida. Authorities remain uncertain what provoked 24-year-old Douglas Burden to attack Deputy Moon. But whatever the motivation, CCTV footage sees Burden rush behind the deputy's desk, attacking Moon and quickly locking him in a chokehold. Uninterrupted, the move could have killed the deputy. That is, if it wasn't for the efforts of other prisoners. Footage shows one inmate appear from nowhere and take Burden down swiftly, just as two others jump on the struggling pair. While the group wrestles the violent felon to the ground, another prisoner takes the initiative to grab Moon's radio and call for backup. All the while, more inmates pile on the attacker, saving that lone deputy Ken Moon's life. Eventually, numerous correctional officers haul Burden away, much to the deputy's relief. Though the heroic inmate saved Moon's life, it must have felt pretty terrifying being at the bottom of a jumpsuit dogpile like that. Violent tastes. When Correction Officer Rachel Harris went to search inmate Bobby Ruiz's cell in a Phoenix jail in June 2013, she thought she was carrying out a routine check. Harris told the prisoner to stand outside the cell while she worked, but Ruiz had other ideas. While Harris was busy searching, Ruiz burst into the cell and attacked her from behind. As the two struggled, the deranged prisoner bit off a chunk of the officer's ear. Two inmates heard the commotion and ran upstairs to pull Ruiz off of Harris. They overpowered him and managed to hold him down until other COs arrived and detained him, sustaining some minor injuries of their own in the act. Though 22-year-old Harris lost part of her ear, she was unfazed and requested to return to her duties the very next day to thank her saviors. For their selfless assistance, the inmates that saved Officer Harris were treated to a few large pizzas. Though they probably would have preferred reduced sentences, I'm sure they appreciated a fresh slice or two. As for Ruiz, he was charged with assault, and hopefully the additional time on his sentence will be harder to swallow than poor Harris's ear. The Stateville Stone Saviors. Back in 1958, health and safety rules were a little more relaxed than they are now. But who needs regulations to keep you safe when you have a surprisingly honorable chain gang to save you? Ira Griffith was overseeing a team of working prisoners processing gravel at Stateville Penitentiary when he noticed some stones caught in the lip of the rock crusher. He leaned into the machine to loosen them, but lost his footing and slipped in. It looked like certain death as he struggled in the quicksand-like limestone within the machine, falling closer to the pit's grinding jaws by the second. But thankfully, upon seeing the officer in trouble, 3 prisoners stopped working and sprang into action. Lowering themselves with ropes down into the huge rock crusher, the inmates managed to grab hold of Griffith. They pulled the 67-year-old to safety, and he miraculously escaped with minor injuries. Regardless of what they were serving time for, those heroic prisoners had some serious stones. Early release. When Willie Williams requested some toilet paper from inside his cell in Kent County Jail, Michigan in April 2019, the task should have been simple. Williams was supposed to retrieve it from outside the cell door, then return to his bunk immediately. The on-guard duty had checked on the prisoner via CCTV. When she saw that his cell door was shut, she assumed he'd returned as planned. But what she hadn't realized was that the devious inmate had hidden behind a pillar obscuring the security camera. By the time the guard realized her mistake, it was too late. While the officer was making her rounds, Williams chased her down and started attacking her. In the melee, the officer lost her radio, so was unable to call for backup. But as the two fought, they inadvertently knocked against a set of control buttons, opening a number of cell doors in the block. Luckily for the Kent County CO, the freed inmates turned out to be some of the jail's most honest, and were all the backup she needed. Instead of fleeing for freedom, they wrestled Williams off of the officer, and she was able to call for the other guards to detain him. It seems early release really is a good thing. Explosive opportunity. In 1960, when a Nevada sheriff called Howard Hoffman witnessed a deputy's truck full of jumpsuited prisoners fly past him on the freeway, he was understandably suspicious. But he could never have imagined what the reason for their joyride really was. Earlier that day, 9 Carson City inmates were on a work detail at a local cemetery under the watch of Mike Riggs. The group was burning weeds away from the graves using a canister of petrol when it suddenly exploded, engulfing the guard in flames. Rather than fleeing the cemetery while Riggs burned to death, without hesitation, the convicts removed their guard's blazing jacket and drove him to Carson Tahoe Hospital. Riggs suffered serious burns to his face and chest, but he owed his life to those 9 honest inmates and their ability to handle the heat. Little trouble, big help. In 2016, an inmate at Payne County Jail, Oklahoma was being escorted to the toilet when his thoughts shifted from peeing to punches. CCTV footage shows the inmate suddenly laying into the unsuspecting correctional officer, even lifting the guard off his feet and throwing him to the ground. But just as the inmate begins round 2, player 3 enters the ring. An inmate almost twice the size of the attacker seizes him from behind, allowing the guard to regain his composure. The pair then wrestle the aggressor to the floor and restrain him until backup arrives. While the jail doesn't condone the Good Samaritan's behavior as a standard protocol, there's no denying that when it comes to an attack like this, clearly, size matters. Holding cell heart attack. When you're awaiting trial, the last thing you want to do is commit another crime. But when the men in the Parker County Sheriff's Office watched the guard outside their holding cell collapse, they were presented with a dilemma. The inmates knew that breaking out of their holding cell would risk adding time to their sentences, but to them, the risk was worth taking. It was the only way to help the unconscious CO. So, as the CCTV from the incident shows, the 6 detainees burst through the holding door to help the officer. Some check his vitals, while others bang on doors and walls and shout for the attention of the other guards. Once the guards arrive, the helpful detainees are ushered back to their cell, and their moment of freedom in the name of heroism is over. But thanks to their actions, the officers were able to resuscitate their colleague, and he survived the incident. The sheriff's department credited the inmates with saving the deputy's life, while the officer himself was moved to tears.
If they wished harm for me, all they would have had to do is sit there and do nothing.
He was right. They certainly didn't wish any harm upon him. Like others we've seen already, they put their troubled past aside and their humanity shone through. Faith in humanity restored. Did this video restore your faith in humanity? Even a little? Do you have any of your own local tales of inmate heroism? Let me know in the comment section below or email me via the email in the description. Thanks for watching.